Content warning. Discussion of sexual violence, pedophilia, my court experience, child abuse, police violence, trauma, death of a friend, violence of the prison system, brief mention of suicide.
Hi everyone, so as some of you know, I experienced child sexual abuse when I was about 8, 9, 10 years old by a man who was in his 40s at the time, and when I was 20 I reported this to the police, and the subsequent court process resulted in this man being incarcerated for 13 years. And this man also sexually abused my best friend for about 7 years, and my best friend is no longer alive today. And I find it really interesting because anytime that I mention that I'm a prison abolitionist, the first thing people say is, what about the rapists? What about the perpetrators, the pedophiles? Shouldn't they be locked away? Isn't that the only way that we can ensure the safety of everyone in society? Isn't that the only way that we can get justice for victims? And I think that all of these are incredibly valid concerns, so I'd really love to attempt to answer some of them using my experience of child sexual abuse and the violent criminal justice system. So from the time that I reported to when it went to court, it altogether took 2 years, and this period of time was incredibly difficult for me because I was constantly afraid for my life because this man had threatened to take my life if I were to go to the police. But I felt like there was no real concern about my safety from the police. There was such a lack of communication from them. I never really knew what was going on. I felt like I was treated more like a piece of evidence than as a human being. And then when I actually got to the court, it was incredibly terrifying because immediately as I walked through the hallway, I saw my abuser there and I had to look him directly in the face, and it was really triggering and really traumatizing. And then I had to go into this courtroom with this room full of strangers and the perpetrator sitting right next to me as I relayed in excruciating detail every single thing that this man had done to me. And it's hard enough to tell someone that you love and trust and that you know cares about you, let alone telling a room full of people that I didn't even know. And I felt like it was incredibly difficult for me to try and express what had happened to me without trivializing it. And I felt like when I tried to say things like he inserted his hand or he touched my vagina and things like that, it sounds so innocuous, it sounds so simple. It's really difficult to express the pain and the gravity of these events because the language we have to express sexual violence is so inadequate. But at the same time, when I tried to express the violence of the events, I simultaneously felt like I was being sexualized by my predominantly male audience. In our culture, we're already taught to read violence as erotic because a lot of our erotic language is violent. And so when I was expressing that I was sitting on this man's lap in my bikini and he forced me to do something, or he held me down, and they're seeing a young woman expressing a lot of these things, I felt like it was difficult for them to imagine me as a child. And so I felt like it was almost titillating and arousing. As a victim of sexual violence, there's nothing worse than being re-sexualized, re-objectified and re-dehumanized in that moment when you're trying to express the pain of it all. And I also got frustrated at how much of a hyper focus there was on the exact sexual acts that this man did to me. It felt like such a clinical way to approach trauma, this event-based model of trauma that's based on the exact mechanics and logistics of his body in relation to mine, because anyone who's experienced any kind of abuse will know that it's so much more than just what is criminalized. For me, I felt like the 7 years that I knew him, there was such an atmosphere of violence around me all the time, having this person in my life. There was a violence in the way that he looked at me. There was a violence in having to walk past his house on my way to school, worried that he was going to come out and find me and hurt me. There was a violence in the grooming and the manipulation and the trauma that I experienced as a result of this man. They measured the gravity of the crime based on this neat hierarchy of how violent the sexual act was that this man inflicted on me, but weighing one sexual act as more significant than the other doesn't reflect the impact in any way in my experience, because I've experienced different forms of sexual violence, and sometimes the most minor forms of sexual violence in the eyes of the law had the greatest impact on me. And all of this contributes to this silencing of victims, this culture of invalidation, where we feel that our experiences aren't bad enough to be worthy of discussion, to be worthy of seeking justice for. And these hierarchies of suffering and hierarchies of oppression mean that we don't hold space for lots of different people with different experiences. I also got so frustrated because the barrister whose job it was to completely discredit everything that I was saying kept asking me so many victim blaming questions, like, when you were in the swimming pool, why didn't you swim away from him? Why did you keep going to his house after he abused you? Why did you not tell anyone about this sooner? And he kept literally saying to me, you're a liar, you're embellishing the truth. The whole time whilst the barrister was talking to me, he was this dominating, aggressive, authoritarian man, infantilizing me, patronizing me, making me feel like nothing, making me feel like a liar, manipulating me. It just replicates the same power dynamics that I felt as a child being abused and manipulated by this predator. It's so ironic to me that the criminal justice system exists to prevent violence and to keep us safe from violence, but instead it actually inflicts an immense psychological and emotional violence on any victims that try to use it. So when people tried to tell me that I should be happy because I was one of the lucky ones that actually got justice from the criminal justice system because the whole process resulted in this man being incarcerated, it feels like a form of gaslighting and a form of silencing of victims, because just be grateful means just shut up. For all the reasons I want to go into in this video, I don't think justice was served in any way, and the whole experience made me so passionately, ardently a prison abolitionist. My experience with the criminal justice system made me so incredibly aware that one of the most significant reasons why I was able to get a conviction from going to court was completely a result of my privileges. The whole criminal justice system operates on binaries. You have to be this pure, innocent victim versus this evil monster. And in many ways, I know that I epitomize this image of the damsel in distress because of my presentation. I am a white, cis, able-bodied, thin woman with no previous criminal record. I have a more posh British accent. At one point, the policewoman even referred to me as a good victim, and she quickly backtracked, saying, of course, there's nothing like a good victim, but I completely knew what she was referring to. She was saying that based on my privileges, I sat very high on the hierarchy of believability. After I came out of the court, I remember the prosecutor talking with the policewoman, and he was visibly angry with her because he'd only just found out that I received an award for my grades at university, and he said if he'd known that beforehand, he would have mentioned that in the courtroom because it would have made the jury more likely to believe me. It's like they're not even trying to hide the fact that there is this very specific script that you have to follow in order to be believed. So rather than keeping people safe, I think the whole criminal justice system actually makes certain groups of people extra vulnerable to violence, because perpetrators will deliberately seek out vulnerable people who are less likely to be believed in court. The perpetrator who abused me, for example, to my knowledge, seemed to have a preference for disabled children. And I often wonder, if my best friend were still alive and he had gone to the police and he had reported what happened to him, would he have been believed? Would he have been taken seriously as a male victim, as a person with disabilities? I don't know if he would have. One of the most significant reasons why I'm so ardently against prisons is a direct result of the fact that I think they inherently individualize problems that are systemic. Our prison system operates on this idea that there are pathologically, psychologically, biologically, innately evil perpetrators who can't be helped. The only solution is to lock them up. And this whole narrative completely depoliticizes the conversation because it essentially excuses the state and society from having to do anything at all to prevent sexual violence or deal with the conditions and the systems that drive sexual violence. Because if the whole prison system is characterized by viewing the problem as being solved by locking away individual people, then you never stop to question the systems that produced these people. It's essentially dealing with the symptoms of the problem rather than the root cause. Patriarchy and capitalism and other systems of oppression are key drivers of sexual violence. Rape culture is everywhere. Patriarchal domination of men over women is everywhere. 1 in 5 girls experience child sexual abuse. I don't know a single woman who doesn't have a Me Too story. This isn't a problem of unique evil individuals. This problem is endemic throughout society. So we can't keep individualizing these problems that are systemic. I have such a beautifully tragic memory of my best friend and I just a few months before he passed away, where I was staying at his house and we were lying in bed together and we were basically apologizing to each other for the abuse that we had experienced. He was apologizing to me because he felt like he should have known that this man was hurting me. I was apologizing to him because I felt like I could have prevented it. I could have spoken up sooner. And it honestly breaks my heart to this day to think of the fact that my best friend went to his grave with this immense sense of guilt and shame and self-blame for not only what happened to him, but for what happened to me. And this is exactly what this whole carceral system, it does. It places all the onus on the people who have experienced the harm to be the ones who have to shoulder the burden of dealing with the harm. After my court experience was over, this woman who I'd known my whole life came to me and she told me that I should have gone to the police 10 years earlier. If I'd gone to the police earlier, I would have saved so many other victims from also being abused by this man. For me, one of the hardest parts of dealing with sexual violence is not the violence itself, but the immense amount of guilt and shame and self-blame I have as a result of that experience. There are so many nights that I'm completely unable to sleep because I'm so haunted by worrying about what victims came after me that I could have prevented, by wondering what could have happened if I had gone to the police earlier whilst my friend was alive. Would he have got justice? Would he have been happier? I've never blamed the victims that came before me, but I am so intensely guilt-ridden for all the victims that came after me, and it's so insidious that I have to shoulder this burden for the rest of my life, probably, of feeling responsible for other people that were harmed by the same man, even though I was so manipulated and groomed and scared for my life and I was a literal child. It's a pretty fucked up system when all the onus is on us as the victims to deal with the problem. The majority of sexual violence is perpetrated by people that we know, and people don't like to talk about it, but people love and care about the people that harm us. I didn't love this man, my abuser, but I did deeply care about him. I didn't see him as this evil monster. I saw him as someone that was in deep pain, who had deep trauma. I genuinely felt sorry for him, and part of that is definitely manipulation. But regardless, I didn't want him incarcerated. I didn't want any harm done to him. And it's such a huge ultimatum to give to someone, to say you either remain silent or you report, and you have this person that you love and that you care about taken away from you, potentially even shot by the police. Which makes it even more ridiculous that all the onus is on us as the victims to speak up and share our Me Too stories and report to the police, when none of the conditions in society have changed to make it any easier for us to voice the harm that has been done to us. Another really big reason why I'm a prison abolitionist is because prisons inherently perpetuate this disposability politics where huge amounts of the population are deemed expendable and disposable. Instead of actually dealing with the root causes of problems in society like sexual violence, powerful people will simply scapegoat certain groups of people as the cause of the problem, usually already marginalized people like trans people or people of color. I'm so unbelievably tired of white women like myself being used as pawns in this sick game for powerful people to play, as they paint us as these eternal damsels in distress in need of saving from racialized monsters. And it honestly absolutely terrifies me, because we're supposed to have 250 million climate refugees by 2050, and climate change is the perfect breeding ground for eco-fascists to thrive. And no doubt they're going to continue these insidious narratives that we need to control the population in order to deal with climate change. So what are they going to do with the prison population and the refugee population? They could bring back the death penalty. They could come up with innovative ways of getting rid of this so-called surplus population. Prisons have always been used as a form of social cleansing anyone that can't be readily incorporated into the capitalist system. Prisons are a multi-billion-dollar industry. There's absolutely no incentive for them whatsoever to rehabilitate any of their prisoners, because they benefit from the profit they make from prison labour. And in the UK, 50% of prisoners will reoffend within a year. And I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that the man who abused me will also reoffend. He's going to leave, he's going to be on the sex offender list, he's not going to get a job, he's probably going to be homeless. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that he will reoffend, especially since, although I asked many times, I never got any information about how he was going to be rehabilitated. I think rather than deterring anyone from committing violence, I think the whole criminal justice system actually incentivizes and encourages people to commit sexual violence, because if you look at the fact that it's one of the least indicated, least convicted, least reported crimes that exist, it's essentially sending a message to society that there's a complete decriminalization of sexual violence. So the system isn't working to deter, it's not working to rehabilitate in any way. If anything, it does the complete opposite. Prisons are the rapists, prisons are the abusers. I remember being 20 years old and knowing in my heart that I had a choice to make. Either I remain silent and allow this man to continue abusing other people, or I speak up and essentially sentence this man to judicial rape and judicial abuse. The rate of sexual violence within prisons is astronomically high, and if we're trying to end sexual violence, how can we condone a system that normalizes it as a form of punishment? We're essentially trying to end violence with more violence. And male sex roles, toxic masculinity, domination, violence, unequal power relations, all these things that lead people to commit violence and abuse in the first place are heavily reinforced within prisons. And of course, prisons are notoriously terrible for instilling any kind of accountability into inmates, because they're immediately launched into shame and pain, their egos wounded, and into denial. So if anything, people are more likely to come out of prisons, more likely to rape, more likely to abuse, more likely to commit violence. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's such a psychological and emotional violence in the whole criminal justice system in and of itself, in the way that it treats people who come forward. And there's a violence in the way that it tells people that you can only have justice if you have a conviction. And if you don't have a conviction, then you'll never have peace of mind. You'll never be able to have any closure. So inherently, the system isn't working for anyone. It's not working for the survivors, and it's not working to rehabilitate prisoners. It simply does not work. If you're someone that's experienced violence and abuse and you want retribution and revenge, I feel like that's completely valid, and it's not my place to say that you shouldn't want that or it's wrong to want that. I do question though whether the reason why so many of us seek retribution is because it's the only form of justice that has ever been taught to us. It's the only form of justice that we know. I wonder if we had been given a wider array of opportunities and options for justice, if we would pick something different. For me personally, I don't want revenge, and I really wonder if it's going to be any help at all to have a culture that's disciplined on fear and revenge and shame, when these are things that often cause people to commit violence in the first place. I don't want the perpetrator who abused me to suffer in any way. I don't want him to be punished. I still have a lot of anger, and I think righteous anger is a great thing to have. But at the same time, I mostly just want him to live a healthy, contented life, because I believe someone who is truly content has to deal with their demons. They have to do the internal work to understand what caused them to externalize their trauma, what caused them to act in the way that they did. They have to look at those things, really take accountability for those things, and really process them and heal from them. And in my ideal situation, I would hope that he would process all this stuff and then use that knowledge to be able to teach other people how not to externalize your pain, and teach other people what led him to have those urges in the first place, so that we can prevent this stuff in society. And that to me would be a great form of justice. One of the most fundamental reasons why I'm a prison abolitionist is because I believe so strongly in the inherent value of all beings on this earth to live a healthy, happy, free life. I don't believe that anyone is beyond redemption, beyond forgiveness, or inherently evil and cannot be rehabilitated. And even if there are some people that can't be rehabilitated, we shouldn't be basing our whole entire criminal justice system around this minority. I don't believe that I have more value as a human being than the man that abused me. I think we just had different circumstances that led us to take different actions. That doesn't mean that I in any way excuse his behavior, or that I'm saying that he has no agency or choice over his actions. And I'm not saying in any way that anyone else has to feel the way that I feel, or has to forgive, or has to want them to have a happy, healthy life. This is just purely personally how I feel and how I view the situation, and I wanted to offer a different perspective than the one that we usually hear, because it's always assumed that everyone immediately wants the people that hurt them to also suffer. I really love the concept of kaleidoscopic justice, which refers to justice as ever-changing, ever-evolving, non-linear. What justice might look like to you now might be different from what it looks to you in a few years' time. Instead of this homogenized, prescribed idea of justice being reaching a certain destination like conviction, instead it's about continuously working towards securing a sense of justice for people. And I also really love the concept of transformative justice, which is asking people who have been harmed, what would justice look like for you? What would healing look like for you? And what can we do to ensure that this harm is no longer possible within our society? And of course, there are so many different ways of putting this into practice. Just some examples off the top of my head are having mental health workers instead of police walking around to de-escalate situations. Mexi on the Vegan Vanguard just made an amazing podcast episode about that. I'll link it in the description box. Transformative justice can also look like having people in our communities that are trained in how to facilitate conversations between the person harmed and the person who has harmed, where they can discuss together how to move forward. Or it could look like community care structures where we hold and help to heal people who have been harmed. When you look at the research, the majority of survivors don't actually want punishment. They want things like accountability and prevention. They want dignity and respect. They want to have a voice to express their feelings. As one study put it, the only real justice is if we live in a just society. Part of this involves dismantling patriarchy and capitalism and white supremacy. In trying to bring about a truly just and equal society, I think this involves making sure that instead of just rehabilitation after harm is done, we are all continuously habituated throughout our lives through access to all the basic needs for survival. To my knowledge, the man that abused me was also himself abused as a child, and I often wonder if he had access to mental health services and to therapy prior to him experiencing these predatory urges, perhaps I wouldn't be sitting here today. I actually have a friend in Canada who's a therapist for men who experience attraction to children, and it's a preventative measure that has been incredibly effective at helping these men from not acting on their urges. Why are we not having more of these preventative measures put into place instead of only hyper-focusing on punishing after the crime has already been done? I also sometimes wonder if my best friend and I had had access to mutual aid and community care structures, perhaps we wouldn't have been so vulnerable to abuse. Perhaps we would have had people to talk to earlier and prevented it from continuing rather than it continuing for years and years. And I also wonder if we had education that dismantled so many sexual violence myths and taught us about boundaries and healthy relationships and consent, maybe we would have been able to understand what was happening to us sooner. And maybe if we all had access to the basic needs of our survival, like food and shelter, my best friend wouldn't have been so vulnerable to abuse because of his disability, and he wouldn't have had to stay with the abuser for so long out of economic dependence, and maybe he would be alive today. All of this requires us to organise in whatever way we can in our communities to dismantle these systems of oppression and to start practicing new alternative forms of justice in the here and now, because we can't just wait for a revolution or a mass change in society before we start to introduce these things. We need to start building this in the here and now. But I don't think it's just about having a revolution within our communities, within our society. I think we also need to have a revolution within ourselves. We need to dismantle the punitive instinct within all of us, the hierarchy and supremacy, the patriarchy, the ways in which we've all had this stuff ingrained in us, how it's become our instinct, a basic habit. I think if we don't do the internal work to dismantle the way in which we've all internalized these systems of oppression, and if we don't do the work to process our trauma, we can just continue the cycle of violence by continuously externalizing all of our pain, all of our trauma. None of this means that prison abolitionists are suggesting we should immediately allow all predators to be released and roam free. Prison abolition is a slow process of transformation, and sometimes temporary separation is going to be necessary. But imagine where we could be if all our money and resources was spent on prevention and genuine justice instead of the criminal justice system. And people always say, well, we shouldn't be spending all our resources on the people that have done the harm. But this is a false dichotomy, because the harm is going to continue to exist until we deal with the cause of the harm. When people ask prison abolitionists, what about the predators? What about the pedophiles? What about the rapists? They're presupposing that this current system actually works. But as I've hopefully shown in this video, the aim of prisons is rehabilitation, deterrence, prevention, retribution, and it fails on every single level. And of course, no alternative system is ever going to be perfect. No prison abolitionist believes that we can live in a society with no harm and no violence at all. But we can definitely do a lot better than this system. We can't keep allowing this system to exist that is sacrificing so many survivors to suicide and years of re-traumatization, when it essentially only exists to make a few people richer and as an excuse for social cleansing. And of course, no prison abolitionists are saying that we have all the answers. We have so much to learn. But this is such an exciting time of trial and error and of learning and growing, and so many communities are already practicing transformative justice and alternative forms of justice, and we can learn from them and try to implement what they're doing in our own communities. Everything I know about prison abolition is basically the result of so many incredible BIPOC scholars and activists whose voices I think we should mostly be listening to on the topic of prison abolition. So we're not starting from scratch in any way, and I'll link so many resources and models and experiments down below that you can look into if you're interested in doing these things in your communities. As Ursula K. Le Guin said, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings." Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me. I would really appreciate if you could like and share this video, because I don't think the algorithm is going to like it very much. And I'd really appreciate if you could consider becoming a patron. Thank you so much to my current patrons for making this video possible. Bye.